Good evening, or I should say good night. It's so late in the evening. Thanks so much for coming for this spotlight session. We have a wonderful panel. As you know, the title of this session has been, we've been discussing this quite a lot and talking about the idea of displacement. And so we have four wonderful speakers, and we're going to try and make this not too formal, but everybody's going to get 10 minutes each, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. Our goal here was to try and have it more as an open format, because we thought that would be more exciting in the evening or at night. So let me begin by just saying a little, for those who may not have seen the full blurb. The description we gave was today millions of people are displaced by violence, wars, conflicts, and persecution. Both global economic and geopolitical processes create crises and massive displacements of people, and at a time fuel racism, nationalism, and xenophobia. This spotlight session features a panel discussion on the role of international organizations in addressing these humanitarian and protection crises, and will also include the individual testimony from a refugee recently arrived in Canada. These distinguished speakers will share their perspective on work of these humanitarian organizations, the challenges in addressing violence, and will consider pathways for building a better world. And one of the things that I didn't do, and I apologize, we have put, as you know, we are on Indigenous land, and we've put a note for everybody. Please do take a moment to read. As noted in the detailed opening ceremony, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the indigenous people of this region. So please do take a moment to read it. Thank you. So what we're going to do is our first speaker will be Perpetua POLO, and I'm just going to give a very brief bio, and I'm sure you'll get to know a lot more about her as she speaks. On these issues. Let's see, where's Perpetua's? Okay. Miss Perpetua Gladys POLO was born and raised in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. After high school, she went to college and studied international law. In 2007, Miss POLO got a job at the U.S. Embassy in Haiti as a Cultural Affairs and Education Department clerk. In 2009, she moved to the U.S., fleeing from political and gender-based persecution. Ms. POLO also obtained a certificate as a legal secretary. She worked at several law firms, served as a translator for her fellow Haitians, volunteered at her local church as a children ministry teacher. In 2017, she moved to Canada and filed for a refugee claim on the ground of political and gender persecution. In December 2017, she was granted protected person status in Canada. Ms. POLO believes that compassion and empathy are the key for a better world. Fighting for the less fortunate is a mission that is not impossible, she says. So please welcome Ms. Perpetua Gladys POLO.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Dear members of ISA and my fellow panelists, my name is Perpetua Gladys POLO. I was born and raised in Haiti. I have two brothers, Vladimir and Wolves. My middle name was given to me in remembrance to my mother, Gladys, who passed away a day after I was born. I was taken to my aunt's house rather than going to my parents. This was my first experience as a displaced person. In my opinion, this type of displacement is one of the most painful. Although the newborn baby is not aware of the separation, nevertheless, there is a void created instantly once it's not being nurtured by the mother. Therefore, growing up, I always felt unprotected and vulnerable. Growing up as a young child, I witnessed extreme violent demonstration in the streets. My late father tried his best to protect me. He would shut my eyes with his hands in order to keep me from seeing the dead bodies in the streets on my way to school. Living in the country where violence is constant, one has to be always ready to move away from home in case of emergency. In addition, you get so used to political instability that it becomes the norm. It became frightening when my late father had to sleep elsewhere instead of coming home because of protests in the streets, when I would hear gunshots and the military would beat and kill people in front of our very own eyes. As a result of this, I got serious anxiety attacks. Later, my brother Vladimir got involved in politics, helping the less fortunate through computer training and general education. This got him into serious problem with the gang members. His wife got kidnapped and got released 3 days later after my brother paid for her ransom. He then fled the country with his family. We couldn't stay in our own house because gang members were constantly harassing us, wanting us to pay for my brother's political involvement. My father and I moved to my cousin's house. There again, I had to adjust to another environment, to another house. Leaving your comfort zone is never easy. By that time, fear has gotten a hold of us. I was a young girl, and I was going to college using public transportation every day. I was always scared and felt vulnerable. With Vladimir and Wolves abroad, I was the only one left in the country. I was scared that I would be the target of retaliation. I don't know if everyone here knows what a big problem gender-related persecution is in Haiti. Violence against women is a huge and difficult problem. Rape is used as a weapon of oppression. Haiti's current criminal justice system does very little, if anything, to protect women and girls from rape and gender-based violence. It was only in 2005 when rape was defined in law as a crime, but before then, it was considered as an offense against public or a simple crime of passion. That law is in the books now, but really not practiced. The perpetrators are rarely brought to justice. The country is small, therefore the victim cannot even move to another city. You are most likely to be found and get killed for reporting. Getting out of the country may be the only way to escape. I was not able to sleep, and when I could, I would have terrible nightmares. Finally, I was forced to leave the country after constant harassment from Vladimir's enemies, and after nearly 27 years spent in a country which I love passionately. That country is the root of my own identity. I enjoy the company of my fellow Haitians, have a good meal with great neighbors who became family. I was hurt and confused, for I could not understand how a country with so much flavor, so much to give, so much history, so much beauty, so much resilience, why did we have to go through that suffering? Mama Haiti had to push away her own children. I moved to the US angry at my country because, again, I felt unprotected, left alone to take care of myself. In my mind, Haiti was a mother who did not know how to love nor to nurture her own children. Haiti raised us, and when it was time for us to give back, she made it so hard that we had no other options but to get up, pack up, and leave. Give all the experience, all the knowledge, and all the affection to a stepmother. Surely it was difficult. When I got to the US in 2009, grieving my country and my father that I had to leave behind, I did not know how I was going to survive. My brother, Wolves, and his wife welcomed me, but I wanted more than that. I wanted to finish my education as a lawyer. I wanted to work and find a place, and lastly, find peace of mind. My brother Vladimir had in the meantime got his status in Canada. He suggested that the best course of action for me would be to come here for me to come here as a refugee. So in August 2017, I moved to Canada, and I claim asylum on the ground of political and gender-related persecution. I was granted protected person status in 2017. Moving into Canada was as painful as it was leaving my own country. when I was in the U.S., I learned to love the U.S. as a mother, as a second mother. And I will be forever grateful to that beautiful country. To the U.S., I owe maturity, professional experience, good opportunity, financial independence, and great friends that I met along the way. But my safety was at risk because in 2018, the current government put an end to the temporary protected status, which I had when I was in the States. I was very scared indeed to go back to Haiti, a place of danger and bad memories. I felt as if I was dying another death. But what a journey it has been since I moved to Canada. Though it is difficult to start over, again, I must say that the humanism and the empathy of Canadians are without comparison. When I came in the little town of Fort Erie from the Canadian border through the whole process, it has been such a respectful relationship. Finally, I now feel safe, and I can hope for a better future. Leaving your birth home is never an easy decision to make. Getting used to another country with a different culture is frightening. The citizens have misconceptions because they have seen pictures of refugees. Some think that refugees are criminal. They don't know how capable, adult, and intelligent we are. The majority of refugees only wants a better future for themselves and for their families. In fact, some are looking for the opportunity to sow the seed that was given to them at birth to a community, and why not to the adoptive country that cares for their well-being. Having to start over when you are by your lonesome can look as if you are climbing a big mountain. It can look as if you won't make it. It can look weary at times, tiring also. You are homesick, and I'm speaking for myself. If I did not go through this, I would have never known how strong I was. By going through this journey, I was detaching myself of all the garbage, all the bad memories of my earlier life. This is a testimony of a journey that brought confusion, pain, anger, tears, loneliness, but strength, passion, determination, joy, peace, humility, and a sense of purpose. My brothers and sisters, we can help changing this world. We all went through some difficult moments in our lives, and I am confident that we don't go through situations just for ourselves. We go through them to help others who will be in or are in the same situation as us. For those of us who do know what a violent country feels like and understand what happened when this country does not look after its citizens, we have something valuable to give. We can help individuals in need by walking in their shoes, by talking to them and understanding their hurt. We can also help our adoptive country by helping them to have another conception of refugees. We can work together to secure a better world for us and for our children. This is a testimony of a journey that brought confusion, pain, anger, tears, loneliness, but strength, passion, wisdom, joy, peace, humility, a sense of purpose, and a hope for a better world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Perpetua, for us to start with a testimony, but also one that talks about a hope at the end, and also the idea of construction of refugees and how we have to challenge those images. What we're going to do is not really talk till we get to the end so that we can open it up for format. So thank you once again. Our next speaker is John Lawrence. Did I get that right in the order? Sorry. I think we changed that, sorry. Our next speaker is Jean-Nicolas BEUZE, and what we're going to I'm just going to say a little about him because there's so much to be said. Jean-Nicolas BEUZE worked for more than 20 years with the United Nations in the area of human rights, peacekeeping, and UNICEF at the headquarters and in the field in Cameroon, Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, Afghanistan, Middle East, and North Africa region before joining UNHCR in Lebanon as the Deputy Representative for Protection, and also in charge of the coordination for refugees and the resilience response plan with the government of Lebanon, UN agencies, international, national NGOs, and donors. Now, there's a lot more I can tell you about him, but I have made a commitment to Jean that we will spend more time with the question and answers rather than his CV. So thank you so much, Jean-Nicolas.
Thank you very much, Maggie, and thank you for everyone to join us tonight. And a particular thanks, I think, to Perpetua, because there's nothing more powerful than hearing it from somebody who has gone through the, how you put it, the sadness of having to leave your own country, the difficulties of adapting to a new one, but also this sense of being proud of having achieved something for yourself, but also thinking of the others who may be remaining behind. And I think what Perpetua was telling us tonight, this personal story, really embodied a lot of things that we are going to discuss with the panelists. But I've been asked by Maggie, and I'm happy to do that, to give a bit the big picture of where we stand today in terms of refugees and forced movement of people. We have close to 70 million people who are on the road as we speak. 70 million of people, that means that every day we record 44,400 people leaving their home, being forced to leave their home. I'm not speaking here about migrants who decide to move because they are looking for better opportunities and they are looking for family reunification, to get a better job, or eventually education purposes. Those are many more, probably 250 million, but it's very difficult to put a numbers because it's difficult to track. We were discussing with the panelists that we often have this impression that the migrants, those who are looking for better opportunities in life, are all coming to the Western and rich world. Wrong, wrong, wrong. You probably know that the majority of people migrating for economic and other opportunities do it in Asia and in Africa and within the same continent. They are not actually moving to Europe or moving to North America. But if we look at then a population which is forced to leave, it's not a choice, it's not looking for a better life, it's actually saving their life. They have, and Perpetua said it, there was a point where she felt there was too many risks staying where she was. We are speaking here about 70 million people who are in exile. Most of them are trapped within their own country. They cannot cross an international border for many reasons, and we can come to that in a moment. But what is interesting is to note that 25 million of them have crossed an international border, and that's what we call refugees. It's people who, as Perpetua was saying, do not trust anymore their mother country to provide them with the protection they are entitled to. Because of who they are, it may be because they are, we were discussing that, sociologists who have uncovered some pattern of discrimination within the country and are discriminated or persecuted for that. It may be journalists, it may be lawyers, it may be medical doctors who are helping some minority groups or victims of domestic violence. But it can be also people who, because of their political opinions, their religion, or eventually their sexual orientation and their gender identity, are being persecuted because of who they are. This is very much the story that we heard from Perpetua. There is another category, the people who are just in a country which is chaotic, conflict. I'm speaking about Syria, about Iraq, about Somalia, Yemen, and we need to realize that we are in a world where making peace is more and more difficult. The international community, politicians, the UN, are completely failing in making peace. If any of you in this room can name the last time we did a peace agreement which lasted for more than a few weeks or months, welcome to give me the answer. We are absolutely failing in making peace. So we have a situation where a lot of people are unable to survive because of the generalized violence or the conflict. And it's important because it's important to remind everyone that we have really those two categories of people who are facing a very individualized persecution because of who they are, and people who, it's not because of who they are, but mainly where they live, are unable to survive in that country. I was on a panel recently with the chief of the operation of the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, which, as you know, probably is operating in conflict. And he was reminding us that a few years back, 20 years ago, when they entered into a country, they were doing their planning for 5 years. And he says now, when we enter in a country, we are already planning for 15 to 20 years because we know that the conflicts are not going to be resolved in 5 years. The conflicts are much more complex. They are really a larger group of people who are using different type of warfare, including some terrorist tactics and urban guerrilla, which makes it very difficult for us, the humanitarian, to intervene in those countries, but very much for the civilian population to survive in those countries. So we have this situation where we have several little or large crises of displacement, of forced displacement. One thing I would like to do, because I see that a lot of, I mean, I'm going to be politically incorrect here, but I have the impression that we have a lot of Westerners here in the room tonight, and I just would like to take 1 minute about where are those refugees and where are those movements of population. I think we tend to forget what's happening, and we are looking at the current situation from our own point of view, Europe, and Marissa will speak about that, or North America here. Actually, the largest refugee population is Syria, has been produced by the conflict in Syria. But one thing that we tend completely to forget is that the second largest population of refugees are no, in terms of people who have to flee their country. It's Afghanistan. The second, so we have approximately 6 million of Syrians, which are outside their country, and you're right, madam, most of them are, the largest group is in Turkey, 3.6 million, another 1 million in Lebanon, 600,000 probably in Jordan, and a few others. But the second largest group of refugees, people who have been forced out of their country, is Afghans, 2.4 million. Equally between Iran and Pakistan. Who speaks about Afghans today? Who is remembering that we have people who have been displaced for decades now? On the top 5 population, we have Somalia. In Somalia, we have people in camps in Kenya who have, it's the 3rd generation. We're speaking about the Somali refugees these days anymore. So that was the first point that I wanted to make. We tend to have a very short memory. Now it's all about the Rohingya, who have fled Bangladesh, who have fled Myanmar to go into Bangladesh. But I assure you that in 6 months' time, we will have another crisis, and the Rohingya will be forgotten. Another thing that I wanted to address rapidly is who are the countries which are receiving most of the refugees? And Madame gave us the answer. It's actually, indeed, in the Middle East that we have the largest population. In Lebanon, at some point, we had 1 out of 5 or 1 out of 6, if you include the Palestinian refugees, a person in the country who was a refugee. What is interesting, and most of the refugees are actually in sub-Saharan Africa. If you look at the other countries, then it's Uganda, who has 1.4 million South Sudanese. You look at Kenya, which is hosting millions of refugees, Somali refugees in particular. But what has changed a little bit over the last couple of years is that among the top 5 countries, we get now Germany. Germany has received in 2016 some 800,000 people, and that has completely changed the narrative on refugees in the media, in the politician, especially here in North America and in Europe, in pretending that the crisis was at our door. But 85% of the refugees will always remain in the developing world. 85% of the refugees will always remain in Africa, Middle East, Asia, and to a lesser extent, but still in Latin America, Central America. We, meaning the Western world, are receiving only a small fraction of the refugees. They will never come to our place. And despite that, the whole discourse that we are having amongst politicians, amongst the donor countries, among who pays for the bill and so on, is all about Europe and North America. So I'm not going to go further than that. I'm really looking forward to discussion, but what I think is really important is that we keep behind the numbers the individual stories, because everything, I've been, like Marissa and John, we have been in the business for many years, and I can tell you there's not one single story which resembles the others, and we need to keep this humanity at the center of our discussion on how do we address actually the displacement of those populations. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jean-Nicolas. Thank you for the opening. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is John Lawrence, a native of Illinois and President Board of Directors of MSF, Doctors Without Borders, USA. He previously served as Vice President of the Board of MSF, USA. Dr. Lawrence attended Dartmouth College and Dartmouth Medical School, then completed a family practice internship and worked as a general medical officer in Tuba City, Arizona on the Navajo Reservation. He then returned to residency and completed training in general surgery at the University of Rochester in New York and a pediatric surgery at St. Christopher's Hospital in Philadelphia. For the past 20 years, he has been a practicing pediatric surgeon, primarily in academic settings, and is currently a staff pediatric surgeon in Maimonides Medical Center in Brooklyn. But what is important, really, that we also find incredibly interesting is Lawrence has completed 8 surgical missions with MSF since 2009 and recently began coursework for an MPH degree through the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins University. So he has gone to many places as a surgeon to Central African Republic, Ivory Coast, Haiti, Syria, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. So I welcome you, John, to share your lens.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for the introduction, Maggie. And it's a pleasure to be here and to not only participate, but to hear what the other individuals are presenting. And in preparation for being on the panel and for this session, Maggie had sent around some kind of general topics to frame the comments that we made, and I found those particularly helpful to kind of, I think, organize my own thinking as I talk about MSF. And so one of the first things she asked us to do was to consider how we view the crisis going on currently with displacement, refugees overall as an organization. And for MSF, that very much is through a medical lens. So because our foundation and our real reason for existence is based on providing medical care, that is going to be the angle or the viewpoint that we're going to be basing all of our activities from. And when we talk about the issues with refugees or populations that are being displaced, I think one of the advantages that we have in talking about this issue is that we work in all of the contexts that they are pertinent. That are pertinent in this continuum of displacement. So Jean-Nicolas brought this up about how it starts in the country of origin in places like Syria and Afghanistan, where we have been and continue to be very active. So we're seeing the elements of the medical aspects that are needed there, but the bigger, of course, context of the society and what's going on. And then we also provide care along migration routes. So that again can be within Asia, Africa, the Americas. This is part of what we do. And then finally, also providing care for individuals once they've settled or resettled to their final country of destination. And again, the problems that one sees and the perspectives and how you need to be managing or approaching providing medical care in all those different contexts is quite different. Certainly, I think, again, Jean-Nicolas brought up another part of this, and I don't think it needs to be reiterated, but there's, I think, a tendency to think that this is only an issue for Europe or North America, and clearly, as he highlighted, the problems that exist within populations that are moving from one country to another within Africa really is much more significant in terms of numbers and certainly duration as well than ones that we see that are a little bit more publicized here today. I think another point that again has already been brought up to some degree, but I think that needs to be borne in mind when we talk about this issue, and again, being a U.S. citizen, have to kind of keep it in this context. But when we get into the political aspects of this and what I think are more the emotional aspects that exist presently, there's a tendency to view this as I don't think this is a direct quote from one of our leaders, but an invasion of people that, again, in the U.S., it's right now about 50,000 individuals a year. It's really not exceeded much over 100,000 in a given year of refugees that have been resettled in the U.S. And so when we think of a population of 300 million people, it's such a drop in the bucket, and versus in comparison, Lebanon being an example where they have 1 million or 1.5 million refugees for a population that's around 5 million, if I'm not mistaken. Again, a very different when you think about the implications of that on your society. But I think framing the discussions that we have and viewing this as a potentially adverse development, I think that the perspective in much of the developed world is really not even equatable to what countries that are seeing large numbers of refugees are having to be dealing with, and whether that's in healthcare, education, or other social services. The implications of that, both for the populations arriving but also for the home societies, are very significant. The second issue that Maggie had kind of sent around to us was to talk a little bit about framing this issue and how would we do that from our organization side. And I must say I'm interjecting a little bit of personal bias. This isn't all me presenting on behalf of MSF, but I don't think you can be talking about this issue and not have some personal elements that need to be introduced into it. So one of the things that I think is is very important to remember in this whole discussion is that when we talk about displaced individuals, we do have the designated refugees, people that have actually crossed an international border, and there's around 24 million of those currently, but there's another in the range probably of 44 million people who are internally displaced within their own countries. And in many ways, these populations, have, very often challenges that are far greater than people who are actually able to leave their country where they were originally from. And so the number of people that are affected in that regard, I think, is often forgotten, and what, again, the implications are. I worked in 2013 inside of Syria and was working in the northwest part of the country in a burn unit and providing care to burn patients. And my thought when I went over there was, well, that I'd be primarily seeing and treating combatants. And in fact, the patients that I cared for primarily were children living in camps for internally displaced individuals who were burned by cooking fires or pots of boiling water that tipped over. So the sort of the degradation, I think, of the society that existed there is something that I didn't appreciate, and what the implications were, where healthcare for those populations was really a dramatic setback from what they'd experienced previously. And so again, I think that the losing sight of those who are internally displaced is another issue I think that bears mentioning. And then when we talk about people who are, and I'd like to use the frame people on the move because it includes to some degree refugees, internally displaced people, as well as people we might think of as migrants. But this concept of having push and pull factors, again, I think has already been brought up. But we think very commonly of war or conflict as being a major push factor, government repression, obviously, and ethnic discrimination or repression included in there. I think another one that's been lost and I think really needs more attention and that all of us should be advocating for is climate change and what that is doing in terms of leading to population displacement and instability that may be internal, but it also increasingly is across borders. And again, I think the pull factors of what sorts of opportunities may exist. Again, I think it's important that we remember that who among us wouldn't be looking to better our lives in whatever way we could, and that people should be ostracized for this or criticized or worse, I think is very unfair. Back in the healthcare realm and kind of talking about, again, other ways to frame the issue of migration, I think that speaking for an organization that its main focus is on medical care, I think that one of the things that also needs to be brought forward is that we think of that as being physical care. So it's people who have been traumatized and may have specific injuries that may need to be dealt with, or who have been, the migrants, coming across the Mediterranean Sea, who have, again, had contact with toxic chemicals. Obviously, the basic needs of minor illnesses, of diarrhea, cough, those sorts of things clearly exist. But I think that one that our organization, I think, highlights, and I think that really needs to be borne in mind, is the mental health effects of what this process is like. So when we, talk about stressors in life, and we've all experienced that in our existence, no matter where we're from, the magnitude of that, and I think Perpetua brought that up to some degree in her presentation, that when you add in the fact that you don't have a stable base for a residence, the unknown element that may exist, and then what's often added on top of that for people who are displaced. So whether it's sexual violence, torture, kidnapping, ransom payments that may be extracted. So additively, that I think it's very important that we bear in mind mental health needs. Next point I wanted to focus on a little bit here, just sort of what sorts of perspectives, what kind of added value might we be able to offer in providing humanitarian care, which I think is a very fair question to be asking of ourselves and for people outside to be asking us as well. And I think I would say, first off, from MSF's standpoint, there's, of course, the actual physical care or the medical act itself and what that may mean in terms of providing dignity, but also providing symptomatic relief, whether that's a physical or mental ailment. A second point of value for us is actually witnessing. So being physically present and providing medical care is a means to be close to the populations that are subjected to the various stresses and driving forces that may cause them to leave their home. And so I think that would be an added value that we have is really being on scene, to be knowing exactly what the context is that they're coming from. And then lastly is to be able to provide advocacy, so to be able to, in the terminology we use, témoignage, or speaking out. So by virtue of being present and providing medical care, we're also able to then be able, in circumstances where it's appropriate, and this can be a very fine balance, but be able to speak out and to advocate for the needs of these people with an informed and focused way of being able to talk in particular about the medical aspects of their needs in particular. So I don't know, probably time-wise could stop there and we can carry on. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John.
Yeah.
We'll open it up for question and answers, because the panelists really felt that would be interesting to see the questions that we had from the audience. For our last speaker for today is Marissa Ryan. Marissa Ryan is Oxfam's International Deputy Director of Advocacy and head of Oxfam's EU office. In this role, Marissa is responsible for Oxfam's multilateral advocacy strategy on refugees and migration at the European Union and United Nations in New York. Previously, Marissa worked with the Irish humanitarian organization Concern Worldwide, focusing on advocacy in emergencies and building community resilience in the East and Horn of Africa. Prior to this, Marissa managed a project on the protection of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender asylum seekers and refugees in Europe, represented the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs to the UN Humanitarian Agency's headquartered in Geneva, and spent a number of years in East Africa, where she worked with the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Kenyan National Commission on Human Rights, among others. Marissa has a master's degree in human rights from the University College of Dublin. Thank you, Marissa.
Thanks, Maggie, and thanks everyone on the panel. What all of you don't realize is that you're now trapped in a horrible sociological experiment run by Maggie, where the Irish person speaks last and will go on for ages rambling and incoherent because of jet lag. But to save you, I do have some pictures, which is also good. Now, I don't want to rehash everything that you've heard from the other panelists in terms of the global picture. I'm going to try and add maybe just 3 dimensions to what we've already talked about. The first is on the situation within Europe, because while we see some political trends that are very similar in both Canada and the US, we also see differences, and this is skewing the overall architecture of how rich Western countries are engaging with refugees and migrants. The second issue is, as the others have referred to, how does Oxfam see this crisis? Is it a crisis? And if it's a crisis, who is it a crisis for? And then the third issue is to talk a little bit about how we frame this. How do we try and engage the public? How do we try and engage policymakers on issues that are now seen as completely toxic and which are unpopular pretty much country to country anywhere in the global north? So the statistics you've already heard about, they're there behind me, over 65 million people displaced, half of whom are children. These are really, really shocking figures and things that I think are important to reiterate, but at the same time, they only serve to mask what is an enormous human tragedy that's unfolding before all of us. As Jean-Nicolas mentioned, many of these people, in fact the majority, are hosted by low-income neighbouring countries from where they fled, over 86%, where this lady was mentioning, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and so on. And the number of people who are hosted by the global north is fractional and marginal. However, even though most refugees stay close to home and flee over borders within their regions, some people do try and move, and they do get asylum or seek resettlement or family reunion elsewhere. And this brings me to the situation in Europe. In 2015, over 1 million people came to Europe. This was seen as an unprecedented political crisis for EU leaders, which was absolutely shocking because they were given so much advance warning. We knew from various geopolitical factors that people were going to start moving, that the war in Syria meant people would start coming by boat, landing first in Greece, but also others will come through the Mediterranean from Syria, but also from Afghanistan, from Nigeria, and other conflict-affected areas. What ended up happening was not an organized evidence-based response where European leaders came together as a whole to try and take a sensible approach, but instead an absolutely toxic scrambling, a sense of whipping up huge fear amongst populations who up till that point had had relatively integrated societies where migrants were viewed as a complicated but positive human phenomenon and something which had been happening for centuries. That same year, in the year 2015, 4,000 people died trying to seek refuge in Europe in the Mediterranean, which turned our seas into a huge underwater graveyard, and something that is an absolute abomination for EU leaders to have to consider. This year alone, over 1,500 people have died in the Mediterranean. This picture that you see on the screen behind me was taken at the Brooklyn Bridge. Myself and my colleagues laid out those life jackets in a photo stunt that was meant to draw the awareness of UN member states and global leaders who were gathered at the UN General Assembly at the time to agree what was considered or going to be a new deal for refugees and migrants. What transpired was not a new deal, but a hardening of approaches by leaders right across the global north, and a decision, more or less, that a new range of policies whose absolute bedrock was to deter people from leaving the countries from which they were fleeing would be implemented across the north. Those life jackets we gathered from the Greek islands, and if you could pick one of them up, which I did, I laid out them, they're filled with things like straw. None of them are seaworthy. And the people who got into them in the first place were getting into unsafe vessels run by people smugglers. They've given their entire life savings. They're fleeing mainly from Syria, but other conflict-affected countries. And they end up in Greece, an EU member state, with the whole of the EU behind it, and they couldn't seek a proper humanitarian response there. What has now happened as a result of the policies that have begun to be introduced across Europe since 2015 is that vulnerable people are increasingly taking more and more dangerous routes to try and seek safety, either in North America, Canada, or Europe. People smugglers and human traffickers are thriving, and women and girls, of course, are absolutely bearing the brunt of the majority of this kind of abuse. And that takes me more or less to Europe. So for me, one of the greatest sadnesses at the moment is that as I work for Oxfam, we were founded during the Second World War to campaign to allow food supplies to go into besieged areas of Greece, which was then occupied by the Nazis. People there who were civilians, Greek civilians, were starving at that time. And Oxfam was formed by a group of people in Oxford in England to try and allow the Allies, America and the UK particularly, to allow food aid in. Since then, we work in over 90 countries in the world, providing humanitarian supplies and development interventions, but we have never had to work in Europe. However, at the moment, we are working in Italy, Greece, and the Western Balkans, providing immediate needs, water, sanitation, blankets, warm clothing, and also legal and psychosocial support for traumatized people who aren't able to access that elsewhere in the EU. Two-thirds of the refugees coming to Europe, I should mention, are coming from 5 countries only, which leads me to say this is a highly concentrated issue. It is not a global crisis. The global crisis for me is a global crisis of political mismanagement. The real crisis, or for all of those people who are now trapped in Europe, trapped in camps in developing countries, and all of those who've died in the Mediterranean and elsewhere in the deserts of Libya and the sands of the Sahara, who nobody will ever testify for or in favor of. The crisis for who, like that, for me, is really fundamental in all of this. What we've seen in Europe is essentially short-term politics, which are decided at national level by largely right-wing populist governments who are whipping up fear against people from other countries, are now prioritizing any sense whatsoever of a common decision on how to treat people fleeing violence and persecution or abject poverty who want to seek a better life where they'll be treated with dignity. This has meant that what was a regional bloc that founded and believed itself to be upholding principles of human rights, signatories to the 51 Convention on Protection of Refugees, and party to all of the human rights instruments that give you and me our rights and enable us to live safely and in peace, are being more and more and more eroded. There's no consensus amongst the 28 member states on how responsibility for refugees should be shared. So what we would consider frontline refugee hosting states like Italy and Greece, who have people arriving on a fairly continuous basis, are left with humanitarian crises in their country, whereas countries like Ireland, where I'm from, are hosting almost nobody and refuse to take in what we would call a fair share, which is decided on the basis of GDP and so on. Ironically, the global rate of migration has been stable since the 1960s. We have a global migrant population of just 3% worldwide. We're not seeing massive spikes or peaks, as Jean-Nicolas alluded to. And all of this to say, we're going to, for at least the next 3 to 5 years, have a situation where when we temporarily decrease the number of people arriving in Europe, populist leaders will laud this as a success, and when they when people are then forced into more dangerous routes and struggle and die, they will see this again as a success. But when people find new routes and end up coming by other pathways and the numbers increase, this will be seen as a reason to introduce harsher and harsher mechanisms. So against this backdrop, what is Oxfam doing apart from trying to provide humanitarian and development assistance for people on the move? And I think for an audience like this is what's interesting. We're trying to get better at understanding what public attitudes are, because for many years organizations like Oxfam had an MSF and UNHCR had the ear of people in power. We had global publics that largely agreed with us. We had direct donations from individuals all over the world who wanted to see less famine, less war, that refugees would be protected when they move, and that human rights would be upheld. Now all of that is dwindling, and we see a global public and a northern public who are now much less sure about whether or not migrants should be allowed into the country in any shape or form, whether they're refugees or what's considered economic migrants. So at the moment we're looking at a whole range of research that's been done across Europe on kind of public attitudes, and there is some good news. To go back briefly, over the long term, actually public attitudes are getting more positive. We see also a generational shift. Younger people, more urbanized young people in particular, are more in favor of refugees and migrants. Their sense of globalization is much wider, so they much more have a sense that the world is their playground rather than a more narrow, constricted view of the world. But there is still a huge amount of people who we would largely term the anxious middle. These are people who are otherwise quite liberal, have positive social attitudes to things like social welfare, but who aren't quite so sure on migrants' rights. So a few things that I find particularly interesting in the research. All of the research of the Overseas Development Institute shows, for example, that when you ask people in Europe about immigration, they react quite negatively, whereas if you break down which particular group that you're talking about, they're much less prone to be negative. So if instead of asking what are your views about immigration, if you ask somebody what is your views on the situation of Syrian refugees coming to Ireland, you will get completely different answers. In the UK, however, people are more favourably to those, disposed to those who already have refugee status than they are to asylum seekers, which is very peculiar because you have to seek asylum in order to gain refugee status in the first place. But it speaks more to this kind of fear and uncertainty about why people are trying to reach the UK, whether or not they're credible, whether what they're saying is even true. In Germany, 2/3 polled in a recent study agreed, however, that accepting refugees is a national obligation. Very positive considering this has been widely contested in the German political system and continues to be problematic for large parts of the German public. Overall in Europe, the 10 Foundation study in 2016 of 11 countries found that there was a majority support for refugees, but this was alongside anxieties about refugee intake, particularly in relation to security because of the number of terrorist attacks we've seen recently in Europe, which are proportionately very small and usually committed by people who are third and fourth generation of that country. They're still portrayed as refugees on the rampage, violent jihadist refugees, etc., etc. There is a marked lack of tolerance, however, for those who are perceived as economic migrants, and Jean-Nicolas has spoken a bit about the difference, but just to highlight, those people are coming from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran and Eritrea largely, which are all conflict-affected countries. I know I'm running out of time, so I will just finish on one last point. What we're trying to do is essentially engage this anxious middle, which is about reaching people in a way that no longer speaks to myth-busting or evidence, because none of that is mattering in the current climate, and all of our research shows that. Instead, we're trying to build a new narrative that is much more values-based and driven by very kind of clear research that we're doing with publics in a range of different countries on what makes them feel emotionally invested and unified with the idea of people being on the move, being part of their societies, being part of their nations, what can they contribute. A lot of this is through doing things like bringing people together, that's Beach in Dublin, to engage in positive stunts, and talking about things like family reunification, which is an entry point for people to engage in wider discussions on refugee rights, but through a lens of the family, which is sacrosanct in almost every culture. I'm not going to keep going because I have run out of time, and I told you I would ramble, but I have been awake since 5 a.m., so please give me some credit.
Thanks so much, Marissa.
No problem.
Well, thanks so much to our panelists. I want to be, cognizant of time too, because we had said it would be in a question-answer format too. So what I'm going to do is, I do have some comments, but I'm going to actually open it up to the audience for any questions, and then give a last couple of comments. Please come to the mic so that we can hear you, or you'll have to shout out, sorry.
Sari Hanafi, professor of sociology at American University of Beirut, and a refugee myself, and I work more than 15 years dealing with Palestinian refugee issue in different locations, from West Bank to Lebanon to Syria and Jordan. And so my comment to Jean-Nicolas, well, frankly, I am, as observer of Syrian crisis and the behavior of the UNHCR, I am quite frustrated, and the same frustration I have vis-a-vis UNRWA. And by chance, my dear friend Filippo Grandi was in the same time the higher commissioner in UNRWA and now in UNHCR. But nevertheless, I will be honest to say they are not sufficiently outspoken about serious issues related to the presence of refugees in some about the political aspect of the presence of refugees. I'll give you two examples. For instance, UNHCR didn't organize a representative of camps, informal tented settlement, what we call it in Lebanon, not to call this curse a word, refugee camps. So they did nothing to organize the camps, and this costs nothing, but has a major impact on this. This is one example. Other example is education. I mean, in Lebanon, you have around 200,000 Syrian refugees for 5 years, almost no scholarity. And we know that Lebanese government fool the donors that they will provide education for Syrian refugees, and they didn't did it. And personally, I talk with the UNHCR officer, and always they don't want to have a trouble with the Lebanese government, sometimes for personal reason, and sometimes really. So it's really intriguing, and I will end here to say, I think UNHCR should side in the model of Doctors Without Borders, who historically very outspoken and being very humanitarian. They know at certain there is a threshold of where threshold from which the silence kill, a silence become complicit. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to respond specifically. I mean, the issue of representation of the voice of refugees is extremely important. In the context of Lebanon, not to bore anyone with the details, it became very difficult because it was the experience of the Palestinians who got organized politically, and the Lebanese authorities didn't want that to be replicated. And it's true that we were unable to then have that kind of organization. Having said that, we had more than 500 refugee outreach volunteers, which were constantly in contact with UNHCR and with all the NGOs there, which were our eyes and ears on the ground and which were reporting about the issues that their communities were facing within the Syrian community or with the Lebanese communities. And there were many other ways for the NGOs and the UN altogether to consult the refugees and to see what they wanted us to do and how they wanted assistance and protection to be delivered to them. The second point is a critical one that I'm happy to address, is that we are often driven by donors. I was in charge of the education program in UNHCR for 4 years, and I can tell you we will go to a number of donors, and I'm happy to name them in this room. The Germans, the DFID, the UK, the European Union, were earmarking the money for to put the children in school. It was extremely difficult to have a discourse with them, the donors, about the quality of education. I used to work for UNICEF. You know it well, that in the Middle East, the school-to-work transition is the worst ratio of all the region of the world. Putting a child in school is not necessarily a guarantee of success. It's not even necessarily a guarantee of civic education, because when the Lebanese teacher were physically beating up the children, I can tell you in terms of social cohesion, that was the worst thing that we could do. But we could not engage on those discussions because we were forced by the donors, as you said, to put a lot of money. At some point, we had more money to put 200,000 children in this Lebanese educational system that my colleague in Central African Republic had to give potable water to 1.2 million displaced in Central African Republic. Do you think that any of us on this table could really sleep at night when we knew that we were forced to put children in an educational system which was not necessarily going to be the solution, but in the name, wrongly, that if we were not putting them in the education system, they will all become terrorists, which I heard from donors and from other UN colleagues, like if education had played a role in, I mean, you are coming from Palestine. We know that in Palestine, it's highly educated people who also engage into violent ways of affirming their political statement. Education, pretending that there's a correlation between the level of education and resorting to violent acts has not been proven anywhere in the world. But we were forced by a number of donors to go in a certain direction at all costs. And yes, we as humanitarians have different role to play. We were discussing that with John. The UN is an intergovernmental body. As John put it 1 hour ago, we have 193 masters, the member state of the United Nations, which range from Iran to Saudi Arabia and from Myanmar to Mexico to the US, Greece, and Namibia. That's what we are for. And so therefore, it's really good that we have the MSF, the Oxfam, the Human Rights Watch, the Amnesty, who can say different things. But if Human Rights Watch, Amnesty is kicked out of a country, yeah, they're kicked out of a country. If UNHCR or MSF is kicked out of a country at a certain given time when we are actually saving life, that has different type of consequences. And that's where we all are left with those dilemma of deciding when do we pull the, how do you say? When do you pull the trigger or whatever, the plug or whatever, and say, okay, I'll get out.
Do you want to either of you add to this? Yeah. Because I think it's we had discussed this a little earlier, this idea of funding, and I think it was a kind of.
Yeah, and I just wanted to follow up on Jean-Nicolas' comment that I think one of the things that MSF as an organization prides itself on is our independence, and so we, the well over 90% of the funds we receive are from private donors, meaning just individual citizens basically, and that gives us then the latitude to be able to determine where we want to be doing things and to what degree and for how long. We aren't subject to influences from government, from other organizations that may be bankrolling the bulk of our work. And so that's a very privileged position, and one we obviously have a great deal of gratitude to the people that do support us, and also clearly comes with obligations as well. The other thing, and I think as we talk about this issue, that I think it's easy to get pessimistic discussing the bigger issue with people on the move, displaced individuals. And as we were talking about Lebanon, I was in Zahle about a year and a half ago in the eastern part of Lebanon. For those of you who don't know the geography well, it's not too far from the Syrian border, but in the Bekaa Valley, where there are large numbers of Syrian refugees, but as was brought out, still sizable numbers of Palestinian refugees now who've been there for 70 years. And in setting up a project that was gearing care towards pediatrics, and in particularly pediatric intensive care, and I think one of the other concerns that comes up as a humanitarian organization is that the local population is going to resent your presence and focusing on refugees, when many of the individuals who have lived there their whole lives, or who are basically long-standing residents of that region, feel they've been looked past or shunted. And so, again, our organization welcomes any and all to our healthcare facilities free of charge. And so obviously the bulk of the patients that we're seeing are Syrian refugees, but there are Palestinian refugees who are using our facility as well. But there are also native Lebanese who just may not have the resources to be able to access and sophisticated care in particular. And I would say, without trying to sound like an expert, but the Lebanese healthcare system is a little bit like the US healthcare system, where resources tend to be in the major population areas, in Lebanon's case in Beirut. And I don't think it's inaccurate to say in the US, connections will often allow for better healthcare in a society. I think the same is probably true. And so this effort to try to provide care closer to where the refugee populations are is actually going to have sort of secondary gain or benefit for the people who live there locally, who may not be refugees as well. So there is a means that you can, I think, view what's transpired in that isolated example as something that can actually be a win-win for the society more broadly.
Any other questions?
My name is Elena Zdravomyslova. I'm from Russia doing research on gender studies. Thank you very much for your presentations. My question is about the strategies to change the narrative of the people of the move about them. This is what you proposed, but do you have any vision of the tools to achieve this change? And I would like to address this question to every panelist, because, for example, in the first story, the authentic story, and I'm afraid I don't remember your name now, but you discussed only the positive impression on your journey to the United States and then to Canada. But you did not problematize the experience of being here. Could you talk about this too? Thank you very much.
Well, it was certainly a period of my time that was very painful, because I had to leave my country behind, and being separated from my family was a very hard and difficult period of my younger life. I think also that the anxiety that I was suffering, and it's as if I was living, but there was something underneath. It's because I was living under so much pressure, it became normal for me to function in a society. There were some times where I had anxiety attacks. I would wake up in the middle of the night, and I would be screaming, I would have fever, I think I still have these symptoms. I am an asthmatic person, and I think that was a result of all these things going on. Where I was living in Port-au-Prince, we were living in the middle of what we say a populated congregation, and so we would hear gunshots, and whenever the population was angry at something, we would hear people screaming and burning tires. These were very frightening. So it was so often. Talking about people killing each other, people, things that are very terrible for a young person to live. So when I moved to the US, these were not so much, but towards the end of my year, before coming into Canada, I would hear people of color being killed in the streets. So that brought me back to what I was living in Haiti. I would hear gunshots again, and these things were these memories that I had buried for so many years kind of came back into my mind. So it was very terrible, and I tried my best to live and to be positive and to carry on while living in this situation. Again, when I had to leave the US, I was driving in the streets, but I was very scared to be stopped by a police officer, because if they realize that I have an accent, that they will think that I am not legal and I'm a refugee and all these things. So I was very, it was very frightening moment of my life. I choose not to talk about it much because I'm still coping. I'm still getting used to my normal life right here in Canada. I choose not to talk about it in a large scale, and you are right. I was supposed to talk more about it, but this was this was a choice that I did. Moving into Canada was better for me, and I do feel safer here because they really understand what it is for us to be in this kind of situations. Not to say that the U.S. are less empathic than Canada, but I think the experience was better. I really enjoyed, if I want to say enjoy, but I really felt comfortable talking about these issues. And I think that right now I'm getting better. I'm functioning really well. I'm being myself. Because one thing, when you are living under pressure, under violence, and you hear things, you learn to live. You have two personalities. You learn to live according to the situation. And right now in Canada, I'm learning to be myself again, to love and to smell the roses and not to run and not to look behind my back. I still look behind. I really hate people standing behind me because I was being followed after my brother got, my brother's wife got kidnapped. All these things, all this garbage, it really gave me a lot of anxiety, if I want to say.
Marissa, do you want to add anything to the changing the narrative?
Sure. Just quickly, I think on changing the narrative and public attitudes generally, what we're seeing overall is that all of the policy interventions are ringing hollow without public support, and we don't understand anymore where the public is at because of this whole mine of misinformation that is built up around refugees and migrants in the global north particularly. So that's why we're investing so much into research in public attitudes, because the sort of biggest group, which I referred to, the anxious middle, they're a very complicated group, and the more you do research into their attitudes, the more complicated it becomes. Because, for example, This group are far more ambivalent around migrants' rights and refugees' rights than those who are either for or against migration. They're not very clear where they stand, and they often contradict themselves. So if you ask questions that are around how important is it for refugees and migrants to be able to contribute economically to their host countries, by and large, all of those people will say it's extremely important. It's the most important aspect. We need to be able to access the skills of people from other countries who are coming as refugees. And that's why, for example, you see Syrians are far more popular people to host than those from the Central African Republic. But then you will also have the exact same group, and we saw this in the research, say, but we want to prioritize people who are vulnerable and traumatized in those that we accept as refugees. Now, those people usually are not going to be able to immediately contribute to the economy. So when you start to tease that out, it's really, really difficult to get a clear picture on what you need to address. But the one thing that keeps coming back as very key across all of our research is myth busting, evidence bases, giving facts just doesn't matter. People don't care or they don't believe us. Organizations like Oxfam, UNHCR, MSF are no longer seen as the flag bearers for sensible interventions, and all of our policy reports and brilliant programming is not respected anymore by the person on the street. The second thing that we've learned is that trying to engage people on real world concerns, which are used as obstacles to better or more progressive migration policy, also doesn't work. So in my country, for example, you can't talk to people about having a higher number of refugees without them talking about the housing crisis. And the housing crisis is real. There isn't enough houses, and people who are unemployed or on low income struggle to find accommodation. But it's not an either-or situation, but having that sort of detailed economic analysis doesn't matter either. The only thing that's working, and the only areas where we've actually seen tangible progress in Europe, is on a narrative that's about values, about finding a contextually specific area. In Ireland, it was family reunion. We now have far and vastly improved our family reunification legislation at a time when all of the other EU countries are restricting it. And it was because of a campaign we ran, there's a picture behind, which was all about how do you feel about your family? What would happen to you if you had to leave your family? And those pictures represent family members that would have been separated under Ireland's previous family reunification bill. So you can see me and my little sister, we weren't considered family under the last bill. People with their eldest son, not considered family under the last legislation, and things like that. And that got people to move in their attitudes, but we're still at a very, very early stage.
Any other questions? Yeah, just.
Hello, my name is Margaret, and I have a master's in cultural analysis and social theory from Wilfrid Laurier, which is in Canada. And I am currently actually working in a settlement agency in London, Ontario. And basically from what I gathered from the panelists here, this goes to both Jean-Nicolas and Marissa Ryan. I've written down my questions so I don't go off topic. So there are two issues for me that arise, basically being able to work in such environments that we are hands-on and aiding these refugees who come to Canada, is that what we can do to make their displacement of refugees as comfortable as possible, since part of it lands on the hands of the institutions, which are funded by the government, and which makes them very similar in regards to their security they provide because of the restrictions that are posted by the government. So that's one of the things, is that how do we make that, how do we handle this issue? And as you mentioned, Jean-Nicolas, is that the international organizations are basically failing or unable to affect the conflicts of certain countries, and there is a rise in the displacement. So basically what my question is just raising awareness enough to deal with such tragic issues, or should there be, since 1945, like the Charter of the United Nations has been written down, there is a time for us to maybe reconsider certain things, to have like more political power in regards to talking with the governments and whatnot.
Just to start, and I'm going to do exactly what Marissa said we should not be doing, which is debunking myth. And no, I think she's entirely right. At the same time, I think we have to be also mindful that we speak to different audience, and there's different discourse which may have still an impact when you bring about statistic, evidence, number, or debunking myths. And one I want to put to you is the fact that we often believe that refugees' ultimate goals is to be resettled to Canada, and we see that a lot here in Canada, and I'm sure that in the past we were seeing that in the US and perhaps a bit less, unfortunately, in Europe, because we never had big numbers of resettlement. So we often see how we can engage on those issues by knowing locally what I can do. I can sponsor refugees in this country, in Canada. It's a bit of a unique program, but it's a very interesting and a very powerful one. But where the myth is that actually a large number of refugees do not want to be resettled to Canada. They have absolutely no interest. A number of them, even in dire situation, even with medical cases, or they simply don't want to go away from the possibility of coming back home, which is the number one priority for the and when we say the overwhelming majority, I mean, we probably, I don't know whether Oxfam or others have statistics, we don't know, but it's probably 99% out of 100 wants to go back home. That's what they wish, despite all the horrendous conditions in which they are living, as John was mentioning in many of those situations. And that's where, I mean, I'm going to quote here my former boss, who is now the Secretary General of the United Nations, Gutierrez, and Marissa is laughing because we heard that a lot, but I think he's right in saying you are asking us humanitarians to fix political problems. And there's a limit to what humanitarian can do. Yes, as John was saying, we have said, and others have said, we have a duty to testify, or more importantly, I think not for us to testify, but to give the voice of people like Perpetua for them to be able to tell the story, and then we go into what Marissa was saying, value-based testimonies and discourse on refugees. But don't ask the humanitarians to fix the problems which are inherently political, with layers of perhaps economic disparities, layers of global warming and other issues, because that's not what we are meant to. And we are actually busy enough with trying to fix what is within our reach. And therefore, the question is not, I mean, I think it's not really for our panel to respond, what can we do about bringing back peace to those countries? The question has to be asked, and that's our role as citizens, to our politicians, to our elected officials, and said, what kind of pressure, what kind of engagement, money-wise, human resources, in terms of, to actually fix Syria today? Syria or any of the other country. I mean, Congo, I mean, both John and I were working in Congo. Congo has been for the last 30 or 40 years in a turmoil, and there has been never any real interest, I think we can say it, on the part of the powers, the regional one in Africa, first of all, but broader, the big powers, to fix the problem. And we have to hold accountable our leaders.
I see there's also a hand there. I'll let you go first, and then I have one that we had put as something important in the context of the conference. Please.
Yes, it's very fast. Yes, thank you to all. You explained the situation a little bit of the situation in the Mediterranean, no? Many people dying there. Well, I'm from Barcelona, and we are very aware of that. And also that we are also very aware about the initiative of different organizations, no? Médicos Sin Frontera has already a ship, but also Proactiva Open Arms, that is a small organization. Proactiva Open Arms is a very small organization that borns from safe wars, life wars, body wars, no? Lifesavers, no? Okay. They start from the initiative of civil people, concrete people that wants to help in Lesbos, and then after seeing the situation there, decided to go, and with rice funding, they obtain ships, and they are saving a lot of lives there. And my question is to the people from your institutions, no? Big institutions, as people that are represented here, if you are thinking at what extent it is possible also to design plans to support, no, this kind of initiatives, no, that are very effective, no, in terms of saving lives, as a hope for, as an initiative for the hope, no, in the situation of crisis that we are living, no, if it is possible also to try to design measures to support all the people that are doing things, real things, from initiative of citizens, to help refugees.
Actually, I think that links back a little bit to your point previously. There is absolutely a need for a global public and political push to bring us back on the right track in terms of respecting refugees' rights. And big institutions like Oxfam or UN agencies or MSF can provide that. And what's actually inspiring is all the tiny places all over the world where people are just coming together organically and doing whatever they can in their small little town, whether it's in Ireland or in Lesbos or in Jordan, to support people who they fundamentally believe need protection. And it's that kind of widening solidarity and support that needs to be captured and given far more leverage if we're going to change a political mindset that is completely racist and anti-migrant and anti-refugee at the moment in the north. As Oxfam, we want to support and work with those kind of movements, and we do, but in terms of giving financial support, it's quite tricky for us because, for example, volunteering, as you said, I know that organization and they do terrific life-saving work off the Greek islands, but the problem is with voluntary organizations that usually people have to go home. And the people that then are left who have been, you know, their lives have been saved, they're left just on a Greek island with no access to long-term advice on what their legal situation is, no clothes, no warm blankets, camps where actually caging children was going on long before Trump was in power. And that's why the bigger institutions need a kind of a more longer-term response where you can plan to support those people over a longer period of time, so that they don't have what used to be quite a high turnover of agencies coming in, delivering one type of support and leaving, and then they're in limbo again, another agency coming in, stopping a gap, leaving again, and then a third, while all of those people's lives are slowly dwindling away through time. However, I think it's much more on the social side. I think it's about bringing people together, learning from these different types of initiatives, and building essentially the kind of global solidarity movements that were way more common in the 70s and 80s than they are now, in a world where isolationism and xenophobia and populism is making people act more and more only in their own backyards. So I can't say on funding that we can contribute, but we definitely are part of a wider coalition building movement bringing together those types of voluntary organizations.
One thing that I find fascinating is that indeed we have all those very localized initiatives of people who are not specialized but who just care. One thing that we are missing, and it's coming back to what Marissa was saying, is how can we transform that into a political movement? Because those initiatives remains very localized and seems not to reach a level where then the politician, the elected official, in particular in our democracies, feel that they have a pressure to then align the policies, the budget, and everything we were discussing before to what actually the population wants. I take this, for example, this country. There was a poll done 6 months ago, so it was already after the Trump and everything, which was saying the #1 priority for Canadians is on the world stage internationally is for Canada to have a role with refugees. That's the thing that Canadians want. 10 years ago, it was about peacekeeping. It was probably the Romeo Dallaire effect. You remember this incredible man who was a peacekeeper in Rwanda during the genocide, and Canadians were very proud about that. Now they turned. They saw that Prime Minister Trudeau did very well with the Syrian, and they wanted Canada to do more. 6 months later, and there's plenty of initiative at the local level of private sponsorship and so on. 6 months later, we have 20,000 or 10,000 this year of people who have crossed irregularly into Canada. So 10,000 people, I repeat, it's 10,000 people, which is nothing. We have, in the last poll, approximately 2/3 of the people who are against refugees and who think that Canada is facing a crisis. So I think what is puzzling me is how do we get such a disconnect between everything we are describing in terms of positive engagement, volunteering, and so on, and still people are giving money to the cause, whether it's Oxfam or whether it's UNHCR or MSF, definitely. People are helping Perpetua to go through navigate the system, I'm sure, in Canada. And still that does not materialize. And when we ask the big question, a bit what Marissa was saying, when we just say refugees instead of saying a person like Perpetua who has gone through 1, 2, 3, then we lose completely the political momentum. And that's what is, in my view, very dangerous, because we seem to be unable to capitalize that and to transform it into political change.
I have one. I see that we're closing up in terms of time. We had one because we had thought about it earlier, and I do want to, given the context of this Congress, where we talk about power, violence, and justice, and it looks like we've talked about, I think Sari brought it up earlier, about how do international agencies look in terms of the kind of support they give. But one of the questions that has come up quite often, even in the news in the past few years and in terms of international agencies, is this notion about violence and security of the workers in these agencies when they go, and if something happens, do they begin pulling back from those regions, and what is the implication of this kind of pulling back, So when countries see this, which are in conflict or conflict zones, it seems something that they would really do if that's one way to push back from international agencies. And does it mean substituting with locals, and what does that mean about the value or life of and violence experiences of locals? I don't know if, I know MSF has gone through quite a bit of that.
Yes, and I'd be happy to speak to that, hopefully fairly succinctly, but it's, very much a central concern of our organization, and security is, taken very, very seriously. We, I think, benefited from our stance of neutrality and thereby helping combatants on either side of a conflict in a given location, and that was, I think, very helpful for our protection, really made a difference in terms of being able to be operating in some zones that were quite active in terms of conflict, but because individuals, both the civilian population, but combatants, whether on two different sides or multiple sides, could all get care in our facility, there was an abiding reason for them to not be wanting to target our organization or the facilities that we worked in. And I think the second point you brought up is a very important one, kind of related to that, is that the people who are at risk include international health care workers, but it's much more the individuals who are based there locally, and I would say, and probably even more than that, are patients in facilities, right? So where's the least mobile population that would be able to evacuate in the setting of an attack on a healthcare facility? And it's those who are sick and whether it's with orthopedic injuries or fractures where they can't get out of bed, or just other conditions that make their ability to evacuate next to impossible, basically. And I think the last point I would just make related to that is that I think we've really lost sight of what are, of the Geneva Conventions, and basic humanitarian law has been challenged on many occasions, and this gets back to that bigger issue of how do we, get that enforced, and I think it's a very difficult one when all of, or many of the major parties, for instance, in the UN Security Council, are actually, to some degree, complicit in creating the conflict, and use this narrative of, another thing that just I find very disturbing that I think really originated in the US is the latitude that's been given by saying it's a war on terror. We're fighting terrorists, and that was the justification amongst, many horrific acts after 9/11, and whether that was, torture, or, being imprisoned illegally that still exists today. But it also allowed for, droneware for targeting of individuals in this sort of anonymous fashion. And it's now been extended, everyone uses it. So the Saudis use it to talk about what's going on in Yemen. And I just heard Putin say the same thing about the Syrian populations that they're targeting now in the south of the country. Well, many of them are terrorists. It's unfortunate, but that's what we have to do. And I think we've enabled that collectively at a global scale, and it's going to be very hard to pull that back in again.
All right, I know we'd love to have many more hours of discussions, but I know that the time is up, and that we have to be cognizant of the people who have to close up. Thank you once again for coming. Thank you to the panelists who have really given us things to think about. So thank you very much, and hopefully the conversation will continue. Thank you.
you.